How to knit neat edges. 10 easy selvage techniques. Hi everyone, my name is Norman. I run the blog nimbleneedles.com and I want you to become a better knitter, and that's why today's video is all about edge stitch knitting techniques. Maybe you know this problem. You are working on a nice scarf or a little pot holder and it's coming along nicely, but your edges just look terrible. Another common problem. You need to pick up stitches or you need to seam two pieces together and it just won't work, or it really doesn't look all that pretty. The answer to all of these problems is knitting neater edges, and this video is all about it. I split it in two parts. First, I'll show you common mistakes you absolutely need to avoid when knitting your edge stitches, and then I will present you with 10 different selvage options from easy to advanced. This will be a very detailed and comprehensive video, so kindly use the chapter function of YouTube if you want to skip ahead. And of course, like this video right now if you want to support my work, and remember to comment if you have a question, feedback, or you want me to record a video to solve a specific problem. Anyway, let's show you how to knit neat edges. First of all, a super quick definition. What is an edge stitch? The edge stitch, often called self-edge or selvage, refers to special stitches on the left and the right side of a flat knitting project. A self-finished edge can be one or sometimes even more stitches wide. Typically, those are extra stitches added to the border of a knitting stitch pattern to create a neater edge, to make it easier to seam, to pick up stitches, or to keep your knitting from curling. Part 1. How do you knit neater edges? There are 3 common problems that can cause the edges of your knitting look, well, a bit weird. First, you are stretching out the first stitch of a row too much. Second, you are stretching out the last stitch of a row too much. And third, you are pulling the edge stitches too tight. Let's take a look. A lot of knitters will use the stitch here on the left needle as a sort of pivot to get some additional leverage as they knit that stitch. And normally this is not a big problem because the stitch is sort of anchored on the left and on the right side, and the resulting stitch here is not directly connected to the stitch one row below. An edge stitch, on the other hand, is not anchored here on the right side. Also, the resulting stitch is directly connected to the stitch one row below. So if you pull on that stitch, it will directly affect the stitch one row below, and this will create one very tight edge stitch followed by a very loose edge stitch. To avoid this, go really slowly and work only around your knitting needle. Don't stretch out the loop as you do. And then guide the stitch through. Push rather than pull, because if you pull you will stretch out the stitch. Rather, guide the stitch through with your index finger and then knit one more stitch and tighten up a bit. And this brings us directly to the second problem. Maybe you are pulling the stitches too tight. Again, this stitch is directly connected to the stitch one row below. So if you want to pull that stitch tight, what will happen is you will automatically also tighten up the stitch one row below. And a lot of knitters, they see those loose edges and then they think, I have to tighten things up, and that's what they do. But you know, it is actually a bit counterintuitive, but in knitting it's not always the best solution to pull tight to fight loose stitches. Instead, before you tighten up, knit one more stitch and then you can tighten up. You can still affect this stitch here, but their yarn created enough friction that you can't affect the stitch one row below, and then you can continue knitting. The third problem is the last stitch. A lot of knitters intentionally create a bit of tension between their two knitting needles to make it easier and faster to knit. Most people don't drop off a stitch like this. Instead, it's more of a pulling motion. And normally that is not a big problem because the stitches to the left, they are still wrapped around the knitting needle, and the knitting needle will act as a sort of buffer. But for the last stitch, that is not the case. There are no buffer stitches here on the left side. Instead, it is directly connected to the stitch one row below. So if you stretch out your knitting too much, what will happen is you will tighten up that stitch and you will steal yarn from this stitch, and you will end up with a really wonky edge. To avoid this, bring the two needles very close together and knit very close to the tips, and then knit that last stitch really gently. And if you didn't pull on that stitch too much like I did just now, then your edge will look super neat. And here is one last little concept I need you to understand. A normal knit stitch is a simple loop, and it's connected to the stitches on the left and on the right with this bar, and those stitches are on the same level. An edge stitch is connected to the stitch on the left with a bar, but on the right, here on the right, it is connected to the stitch one row below. See how it circles around? And this means no matter how neat you knit the edges, the edge stitch will always look different than all the other stitches. And the only way to fight that is using a special selvage stitch, and that's what the next chapter is all about. Part number 2, the best selvage stitches in knitting. In the following couple of minutes, I will present you with 10 different selvage stitches. Why so many? Well, most of them do look different, and since tastes differ, I wanted to give you the choice. But also some are more suitable for seaming or picking up stitches than others, and some are stretchier than others as well. So depending on your project, you may need a different selvage. It's not one for all. And by the way, here is a quick tip. I will try to publish more detailed videos for most of these selvage stitches on my second YouTube channel. I'll link it to you up in here and in the description below. So in case things are a bit too fast here, subscribe to my second channel because it focuses on knitting technique videos without long intros, and there's always a slow motion recording as well, so perfect for beginners. Number 1. Chain stitch selvage. The easiest and probably most popular edge stitch technique is the chain stitch selvage. It comes in many different variations, and it will create a super neat edge. If you're knitting stockinette stitch, it will not really prevent curling, and contrary to what you might find in a lot of other tutorials, it's not suitable for picking up stitches in 90% of all cases, but more on that later. Let's show you the easiest and most versatile chain stitch selvage repeat in my opinion. On the right side, slip this first stitch purlwise with yarn in back, and then continue knitting according to your pattern, and then knit the last stitch as well. So continue knitting across and then knit the last stitch. This is stockinette stitch, so I have to knit the last stitch anyway, but maybe you're knitting a different knitting stitch pattern, then knit the last stitch. And on the wrong side, slip this first stitch purlwise with yarn in front, and then knit across, and then purl the last stitch. Again, this is stockinette stitch, so I have to purl the stitch anyway, but if it isn't, still purl the last stitch. And if you repeat these 2 rows over and over again, you will create this super neat edge. You can also do it the other way around. So you knit the first stitch, and then you slip the last stitch, and then you purl the first stitch and slip the last stitch. And actually you will find so many other different variations like German chain stitch selvage, French, Belgian, Russian chain stitch selvage. And the biggest difference really is if you slip the first or the last stitch. And this really matters because some people, they tend to rather stretch out the first stitch as they knit, and others tend to stretch out the last stitch. And depending on what kind of knitter you are, you may prefer a selvage technique where you slip either the first or the last stitch. For all other practical reasons, those stitches are really identical. There are two more things I need to add. If you are knitting garter stitch, then the chain stitch selvage works a bit differently. In that case, you have to slip the first stitch of every row purlwise with yarn in front, so like this, and then you can continue knitting in garter stitch and you will create this beautiful edge. So always slip the first stitch purlwise with yarn in front. The second tip is something for advanced knitters. If you look very closely at your chain stitch selvage, then you will see that there's always one leg that is a bit longer. It's the right leg here on the right side and the left leg on the left side. And that's because you're not doing the same on both sides. You are slipping the yarn in back once and once with the yarn in front. And this leads to a different orientation of these edge stitches. If you want your edges to look exactly the same, meaning it's the left leg on both sides that is longer, you have to knit it like this. On the right side, everything stays the same. So you slip the first stitch purlwise with yarn in back, and then you knit across and knit the last stitch. The only difference is the first stitch on the return round. Here you don't slip that stitch purlwise, you slip it purlwise as if to purl through the back loop, so like this, and then you continue purling across or knitting across, and then you purl the last stitch. Now you might wonder, where is the difference between the standard version and the version I just showed you? Well, with the standard version, both edges on either side behave in the same way, and here both edges look the same way. So maybe if you want to pick up stitches, then pick this version, and if you're knitting a nice lace shawl, pick this version. Number 2, a garter stitch selvage. The next selvage is probably the easiest. It's a garter stitch edge, and it can be a great choice if you want a slightly firmer edge. The repeat is super simple. Just knit the first and last stitch of every row. So knit the first stitch and then continue in pattern. In this case, this is stockinette stitch, which means I have to knit across. But this selvage works for any knitting stitch. And then knit the last stitch as well. Then turn around, knit the first stitch, and then knit according to pattern. In this case, this is purl stitches all over. And then knit the very last stitch as well. Let me get there. So purl and then knit the last stitch. So this is how the edge will look like. If you are knitting stockinette stitch, then it will help a little bit against curling. And a lot of people say they love the way those little beads look like. The garter stitch edge can also be a very smart choice for seaming, because there is a garter stitch version of the mattress stitch as well. So when you have, I don't know, a brioche stitch or ribbing or any other knitting stitch pattern where you end up with purl ridges and similar structures, you can use a garter stitch edge to join these two pieces in a very invisible way. And the best part is the garter stitch mattress stitch, it doesn't leave this big ridge on the wrong side, so it's definitely an option you need to consider. If you want an even tighter edge with more pronounced bubbles here, then you can also knit the first and the last stitch of every row through the back loop. So instead of knitting the first stitch, you knit it through the back loop, and then you knit across according to your pattern. You knit across, and then you knit the last stitch through the back loop as well. And this will create this edge here. The twisted slip stitch selvage. If you want a more ornamental chain stitch selvage, then you can also twist the stitches. Depending on your tension, this edge can be a bit tighter. To knit this selvage, slip the first stitch of every row with yarn in front knitwise, and then continue knitting and knit the last stitch. It's the same repeat in every row. So knit across, and then knit the last stitch, turn around, and then slip that stitch with yarn in front knitwise again. So you are twisting it around and then purl across, and again knit the last stitch of the return row as well. Knit it, and you can see it is twisted. So there you go. And this will create this edge here. If you knit it like this, then the edge stitches will cross from left to right. If you want it the other way around, meaning the edge stitches cross from right to left, you have to knit it like this. So slip the first stitch with yarn in back as if to purl through back loop. Knit across and purl the last stitch. So it's exactly the other way around. So here are the two edges side by side. The difference is quite minor, and I guess it really boils down to personal preferences and which version is easier to knit for you. Number 4, a double or triple garter stitch selvage. If you want to prevent your knitting from curling, then a double or triple garter stitch selvage is by far the easiest option. Instead of just knitting the first and last stitch of every row, you knit the first 3 and the last 3 stitches of every row of your project, no matter which side you are on. So you knit the first 3 stitches, or 2 or 4, it can be any number in fact. Then you continue according to your pattern. In this case, this is just knit stitches as well. And 3 stitches or 2 or 4 stitches before the end, you knit the last 3 stitches as well. And then you turn your work around and knit those first 3 stitches again. And then you continue according to your pattern. In this case, this is purl stitches. Purl stitches and 3 stitches before the end, you switch to knitting those last 3 stitches. And as you can see, you end up with these reversible and really wide borders that will prevent your stockinette stitch from curling. So it's a very helpful selvage for scarves and blankets and so on. It's maybe not the ideal choice for seaming though. Number 5, double seat stitch selvage. A lot of people don't like the way garter stitch looks like. And I have to be honest with you, I am one of them. But there is a super simple solution. Knit a double seat stitch selvage instead. To knit it, knit the first stitch and purl the second stitch of every row. Then knit across according to your pattern until you come to the last 2 stitches, and then again purl 1 stitch and knit 1 stitch, and then turn your work around and again knit the first stitch and purl the second stitch, then knit according to your pattern. That ball is coming closer, and the last 2 stitches again, purl 1 and knit 1 stitch. And as you can see, it's a really beautiful and neat edge, and it's actually reversible. So it is my favorite selvage for blankets. And of course, you can also knit it wider, say 4 or 6 stitches. Just repeat 2 or 3 more times. I have to say though, it's a very beautiful edge, but you cannot really use it for seaming or picking up stitches. It just keeps your knitting from curling. Number 6, the double twisted selvage. If you are looking for a really firm edge that only creates 1 stitch for every 2 rows, then the double twisted selvage might probably be your best choice. It looks like this. And here's how to knit it. In every row, slip the first stitch knitwise with yarn in back. And then knit across according to your pattern. And then knit the last stitch of every row through the back loop. Then turn around again and slip the first stitch knitwise with yarn and back, and then continue according to your pattern and knit the last stitch through the back loop again. Again, this is how the double twisted selvage will look like. It creates a very tight and firm edge, which will be perfect for any project where you don't want a stretchy edge. Number 7, double stockinette stitch selvage. The next edge stitch is my personal favorite. Double stockinette stitch is just such an underrated knitting stitch pattern, and it truly deserves more attention. You can use it to create these beautiful edges. So here's how to knit it. Knit the first stitch, slip the second stitch purlwise with yarn in front, and knit the third stitch. Then continue in pattern until you reach the last 3 stitches and repeat. So knit 1 stitch, slip 1 stitch purlwise with yarn in front, and knit 1 stitch. Then turn around, and from here it's exactly the other way around. So slip this stitch purlwise with yarn in front, knit 1 stitch, and slip the third stitch purlwise with yarn in front as well. Continue in pattern until you reach the last 3 stitches. Let me get there. And then slip that stitch purlwise with yarn in front, knit 1 stitch, and slip the last stitch purlwise with yarn in front again. Repeat these 2 rows over and over again to create the double stockinette stitch selvage. I feel it's very beautiful on stockinette stitch, and as you can see, it keeps your knitting from curling. It's also by far the best edge for brioche stitches, and it will create a little pocket. See? And you can use this pocket to insert drawstrings or wire or even a bit of padding. So there are actually so many use cases. Definitely give it a try. Number 8, the I-cord edge. I really don't know who is responsible for the I-cord hype, but there is no denying you will find them around every corner, especially if you are knitting a lot of shawl patterns. You may already know the I-cord bind off or the I-cord cast on, but there is also an I-cord edge. Here's how to knit that. The I-cord edge is a 3-stitch selvage, and the repeat is a bit harder to memorize. Slip the first stitch purlwise with yarn in back, and then slip the second stitch purlwise with yarn in front, and knit the third stitch. Then continue in pattern until you are 3 stitches before the edge. Then you knit 1 stitch, slip 1 purlwise with yarn in front, and purl 1 stitch. This is the repeat for the right side. And on the wrong side, you need to slip the first stitch purlwise with yarn in back, knit 1 stitch, and slip the third stitch purlwise with yarn in front. Then continue knitting in pattern until you are 3 stitches before the edge. And here you need to slip 1 stitch purlwise with yarn in front, knit 1 stitch, and purl 1 stitch. And this will create the I-cord edge. Number 9, the brioche stitch selvage. The 9th technique I want to show you was inspired by a reader commenting on my blog. They probably meant something totally different, but I really like the results and I feel it's super beautiful, so I didn't want to keep it from you. So here's how to knit that. So there's 1 setup row and you only have to knit it once right after your cast on, and I'm just going to pretend this is my first row. So bring the yarn to the front and slip 1 stitch purlwise with yarn in front, and then you have to create 1 yarn over, and then you can finish the rest of your row according to your pattern. And on the return row, you slip the first stitch purlwise with yarn in front as well. And then you create a yarn over and knit according to your pattern. And when you come across the yarn over here, you purl it together with the edge stitch like this. And then you turn around. And on the right side, you slip the first stitch purlwise with yarn in front again, create a yarn over, finish knitting the row according to your pattern. And when you come across the yarn over, you knit it together with the edge stitch. And if you repeat the last 2 rows over and over again, you will create this super fluffy edge stitch. Edge number 10, the stockinette stitch edge. The last selvage stitch I want to show you is the seam edge. It's nothing else but adding 1 or 2 stitches in stockinette stitch to either side. So why would you do that? Wasn't the whole point of this video showing you how to avoid this edge? Well, quite honestly, it is the best edge for seaming. Join 2 pieces like this together with mattress stitch and you won't see the seam at all, just this beautiful little column of knit stitches. But there is another reason as well. It is also the best edge for picking up stitches. You will find tons of tutorials recommending a slip stitch selvage for picking up stitches, but often that is not the best idea. Most stitch patterns don't have a square gauge, meaning you need more rows to cover 5 inches than stitches to cover the same distance. But typically it's not twice as many rows, more like 10 stitches times 15 rows. And with a slip stitch selvage, you can only pick up 1 stitch every 2 rows. As a result, your border may pucker, curl, or look weird. The only exceptions are the gussets of socks. Here you want to get narrower anyway, so slip stitches are quite a good choice. But for most other knitting stitch patterns, it's probably better if you pick up a stitch for every row and then skip every 3rd or 4th stitch. So I'm not picking up that stitch, I'm picking up a stitch through that stitch. Sure, I mean, those slip stitches, they make it super easy to pick up stitches, either with your crochet hook or your knitting needle. But in most cases, the resulting border or fabric is not ideal. And here's one last little tip. When you're knitting lace, you will often need a super stretchy edge, far beyond what any of the selvage options I just showed you will be able to offer you. But here's the secret. You actually don't need to learn a new edge stitch at all. You can use a chain stitch selvage or a twisted chain stitch selvage as well. But you need to make sure your edge stitches are loose enough. Here's a simple trick. So slip the first stitch as normal, then knit the 2nd stitch, and instead of pulling tight, you pull the stitches out, and then you can continue knitting. And it may look a bit wonky at first, but if done right, it will look quite beautifully once you blocked things. You can also add a yarn over and drop it in the next row. Anyway, that was my video on how to knit neat edges and the best selvage stitches in knitting. Please like this video if you enjoyed watching, comment with your questions and your feedback, and of course, consider subscribing to my channel in case you don't want to miss any new videos. Happy knitting and enjoy the rest of your day.